empire together with his son. And after 12 years, they ascended from a cave in which they were living. And when they came out, they saw that they were people who were farmers and picking sheaves of wheat. And Rav Shimon Bar Yochai was very frustrated that they did not know Torah. And he actually, the Gemara says that he looked with his eyes upon an individual and he burnt the person asunder. He destroyed, he killed the person essentially. And the Gemara says that a voice came out from Shamayim and said, did you come out of the cave ultimately to destroy my world? What benefits do I have for you ascending from the cave with your son if you're going to cause the same destruction that you were sitting for in the first place? And so this alludes to two things. Number one, it alludes to Korban. It alludes to destruction as we mark it today. Certainly the destruction that Shimon Bar Yochai caused, the proclamation from Hashem that destruction should not be in this world, and hence our reflection upon the destruction of Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash. It also alludes to the fact that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was criticized by Hashem for not being tolerant of the people around him, for not being accepting by the fact that there are many people who are not necessarily scholarly, who did not have an opportunity to have the introspect and understanding of Torah. Nonetheless, he demonstrated this insensitivity and this impatience with them, which resulted in death. And so too, this is a lesson to us with regards to the Churban Habayit, that we have to be more sensitive, more patient with the people around us, particularly those people we might not necessarily feel are on the same level or the same level of understanding in our Yiddishkeit and our Judaism as well. And hence, there are those who explain that Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir, the word kalir comes from the word floor. Floor in Aramaic is actually an eye balm, and it was a medication that was applied to the eyes to help someone who was crying, almost like a reaction to an allergic reaction. I don't know if there's any relationship whatsoever, but it's interesting because people place in their swimming pools chlorine, and very often chlorine causes a reaction to the eyes. So it could be that there's a relationship between fluor and chlorine. Fluor caused a sensitivity to the eyes, and hence he was called Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir from chlor because he was consistently crying, because he was always involved in the Churban, in the destruction of the temple. The majority of the kinot actually do not describe the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, all except for two, but they describe more about the various tragedies that befalled and that transpired amongst the Jewish people during the course of history. It's something that I explained last Shabbat. If you look at Parshat Masei, Mem Samech Ayin Yud, Masei describes all of the hasaot, all of the masaim, the various journeys that Am Yisrael took in the desert for 40 years. The question is, why is it necessary to delineate all of those places again that we went through in the desert? They're already listed in the Torah when they actually transpired. And there's an interesting comment that I saw from Rabbi Riskin, who explains that in actuality, just as we say ma'aseh avot siman labanim, something that we mentioned yesterday, we could also say masa'eh avot siman labanim. The journeys of our fathers are also meant to teach us a lesson. The Torah comes to tell us that in order for us to search forward in history, we have to be able to reflect back in our history as well. Without our ability to reflect on the past, there is no way that we can possibly embrace a future. And for that reason, the Torah teaches us in Masa'eh that every journey that we have, every stop that we took in the Torah is also meant to teach and infuse us with a lesson. What happened there? What transpired? What can we learn from that particular event and happenstance? And sure enough, as a result of that, we understand as well, the Rambam says that the 40 years that the Jewish people traveled in the desert represent actually the long history of the thousands of years of the Jewish people as well. So we incorporate this lesson today through the kinot, not only reflecting upon the destruction of Yerushalayim, but also reflecting upon the various events that transpired in an attempt to persecute the Jews. Of course, the Holocaust, the Crusaders, the Inquisition, the tragedy in York and the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the Chazal say in the Gemara, "Bechol dor shelo nivneh Beit HaMikdash ki'ilu necharav biyamav." Every generation that does not experience the reconstruction of Jerusalem and the Beit HaMikdash, it is as if they have experienced again the destruction of the temple. So it's not only reflecting upon what happened, but reflecting upon what happens currently. Because if we don't see the rebirth, then we are re-experiencing the destruction once again. Interestingly enough, the format with regards to the kinot, in actuality, if you look at the Seder of the kinot, we are reflecting upon and going through really a large portion of the Tanakh, of the Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ktuvim, in the historical movement. Ot Vav, the Kina Vav, talks about Shabbat, which I'll mention in a few moments. The creation of the world, Chet through Tet, to describe the connection of the events in the Torah itself of destruction, as we just read in the Torah, describing what would happen to us should we not, God forbid, adhere to the mitzvot. Tet Zayin are the events of Titus and the Churban itself, the destruction of the temple. Yud Zayin is the detailed after effects of all of the consequences, the horrible consequences that ensued as a result of the destruction of the temple. Im tochalna nashim piryam, if women would devour their children, their babes, and so on and so forth. And finally, Chaf Aleph, describing the destruction of the Avzei al-Lebanon, the Talmidei Chachamim, the outstanding scholars that were all killed by the Roman Empire during the Churban Bayit Sheni. If you look at the kinot, almost every kinot has a cyclic overtone to it, so that almost every kinot goes according to a cycle of Aleph Bet. So the first stanza starts with an Aleph, the second with the Bet, the third with the Gimel, and so on and so forth. Why is this? The reason why is because we, the Jewish people, believe in the cyclic opportunity for us to demonstrate our resilience. So the entire, for example, the entire Gentile holiday of Easter is really predicated upon the Jewish concept of an egg. And that is why in the Sudat Havra'ah, when people Chas v'Chalila are experiencing mourning, when they come back from the cemetery, they are given eggs. Eggs, or for example, when Esav confronts Yaakov Avinu, and he says, "Halideni na min ha'adoma hazeh," he says, "Give me from the lentils that you are cooking." Yaakov, Chazal explains, is involved in cooking lentils because he's mourning the passing of Avraham. And the reason why we eat these round foods, lentils, hummus, eggs, is because we believe that just as there might be departure, there is once again arrival and revival, an ability for us to build once again as we anticipate the destruction of the, the destruction of the Mikdash. Also, hopefully, the reconstruction of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim as well. When we look at the first kinah that we're going to recite, Shabbat Su, the question that's posed is, why is it that we begin the kinot, with the concept of Shabbat? The obvious answer is that we're talking about Shabbat, the creation of the world, and it challenges us within this kinah to be able to relate to the Beit HaMikdash. Quite honestly, it's very hard for us to relate to such a foreign entity that we've never seen, never experienced. Perhaps, if you ever have an opportunity, by the way, next to the Kotel, there is a new kind of like a museum experience where they've opened this 3D model. You sit on, I think it's called virtual reality, and you sit on a chair and you have these goggles that you can actually experience walking through the temple. You see that it's actually extremely well done. And that's the closest really that at least I've come to understanding or experiencing a little bit of what went on in the temple mount in the Beit HaMikdash. But it's very, very foreign. And for that reason, Chazal instituted many things in our daily tidings in order for us to remember the Mikdash. So, for example, one of the reasons why we wash our hands prior to eating bread or prior to eating wet fruit or whatnot is in order for us to remember what's called Schach Tumah, which is the idea that the transference of Tumah was through a liquid, and we wash our hands even though we're in a constant state of Tumah, of impurity. Nonetheless, we want to preserve the concept of being bitaher ourselves, purifying ourselves vis-a-vis these various practices. And the truth is, the reason why we have to do this, why Chazal felt that we had to do this, is because it would become such a foreign entity that we could not possibly relate to it. So they instituted these various halachic practices in order for us to be able to remember some of the confines and the ideas of the Mikdash. I remember we are Levian, so there's the Klei HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. I'm sure many of you have been there. They actually, I don't know if they still have it, I haven't been there in a long time, but they actually had, by the chatzotzrot, by the trumpets, in this little museum, they had a sign-up book for Levian. You could sign up to be at what number you'd be picked to actually blow the chatzotzrot when the Mikdash would be built. And my father signed up. I think it was like number 5,700 or something like that. So whatever it is, it's just like for them, it's supposed to become a reality. And that's the way we're supposed to see it. But this kinot addresses the fact that it's a very, very foreign entity from us. And it refers to 5 places in the kinot. One is the Mishkan, the second is Gilgal, the third is Shiloh. If you look at page 154, referring to the art scroll, Pachad Chet Shiloh, Takaf Sodea. Here it refers to the sin that was transgressed in Shiloh. It refers also to Nov, Ira Kohanim. Nov had 85 Kohanim, which Shaul butchered to death because he felt that they were in allegiance with David HaMelech. It was a terrible, terrible catastrophe. And in fact, the Gemara says that as a result of Nov, Ira Kohanim, when Shaul slaughtered these Kohanim, this would cause the destruction on Tisha B'Av. So the Gemara makes an association between the two. The question is, when we look at this Pachad Chet Shiloh Takaf Sodea, what exactly is this Chet Shiloh? What is the sin that transpired in Shiloh? It's a question that's posed by Rav Soloveitchik. And he explains that Shiloh was where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, rested as Bnei Israel entered Eretz Israel. They placed the Mishkan in Shiloh. But the halacha was that the Mishkan was kitsha l'sha'ata v'lo kitsha l'atid lavo. The halachic status of the Mishkan was that it remained sanctified just for the short period of time that it was resting in Shiloh until Bnei Israel had Yerushalayim and built the Mikdash. Then it lost its sense of Kedusha. Says the Rav, that is the chet that's being described here. We too no longer can relate to the concept of the Beit HaMikdash. The Kedusha of the Mikdash, the holiness of the temple, has become so foreign from us. It is such a foreign entity that we too proclaim it's kitsha l'shata v'lo kitsha l'atid lavo. It no longer resonates with us. We do not understand or appreciate its kedusha, and that in itself is a problem with our inability to relate to it in of itself. Just to bring it home. I actually, this is it's going to sound humorous, but it's quite sad at the same time. I went to a kehillah in the United States, Orthodox kehillah, and I spoke, and as every rabbi, I finished off with the famous closure, Shenizkeh Kulanu, Lirot B'Tuv Yerushalayim, B'Meira B'Yameinu Amen, we should be in Eretz Israel. And I kid you not, an Orthodox guy comes over to me and he says, Rabbi, he says, are you serious? I said, what do you mean? He said, I mean, you really believe that all of us should go to Israel? I said, yeah. I said, we daven 3 times a day Shmona Esrei, Uvnei Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, Bonei Yerushalayim, Mikabetz Titrei Amo Yisrael, V'nechazena Aneinu B'Shuvcha L'Tzion B'Rachamim. I mean, what do you think is going on in those prayers? And he said, that's just to visit Israel, but not to live in Israel. And he was being quite serious. So I thought of this kinot at the time, that this is a problem, that we cannot even reflect upon the fact that it is appropriate for us, and that how inappropriate it is for us that we are so estranged from the concept of the Mikdash, and this is what's being described here. Shabbat Shalom.
We're going to say these kinot to ourselves. We're not going to say this for responsibly.
הלך לך וחברי למה בית נעמך במעון זכרתנו מהילד.
We're going to go now to the Kina Zayin, the seventh Kina. It starts with Echa Atzta Be'apecha. Echa Atzta Be'apecha is literally a question. How could you, God, have done this to us in your anger? And it's an act of desperation to forge such questions. These questions in context are legitimate. And one has to wonder about many things that happen in the world. The famous question, tragically, how many people have asked, how could the Holocaust have taken place? How could God have left us as such? And interestingly enough, if you look at the consequences of the Holocaust, 50% of survivors of the Holocaust actually became or went closer to God, to their religiosity and their subservience. And 50%, half the percentage of the population of survivors, rejected God outright. And I think that itself says something. Yesterday, I described how what a legitimate question it is for people when they ask me, how do you continue to survive? How do you continue to face every day? The truth is that I do discuss often even with my wife about whether or not or how could God have done as such. But I will tell you that the conclusion that we have consistently is that actually that we believe in God. Our faith is not really shaken. We certainly have questions, certainly wonder, should have, could have, would have, but our faith has not really been compromised. And I think just the opposite. I can't really understand people who, God forbid, go through a tragedy and don't believe in God. I think it's much harder for them in terms of what are they grasping onto? Where do they go from here? How do they really continue in a sense? And the question that's being asked here as well is not on a personal level, but on a national level. How could God have vented such anger at us that the consequences would be as such? And it's a legitimate question. Shlomo HaMelech asked the question, Shlomo HaChacham Mikol Adam, the wisest of all men that walk the earth. He could never understand why the Parah Adumah, the red heifer, when it was burnt to the ashes, that the Kohen who would sprinkle the ashes on the person who was Tameh Meit, that Kohen himself would become Tameh. Here he is purifying someone. Why would he himself become Tameh? This is a question that Shlomo HaMelech pondered for a long time and never could possibly understand. And he actually says in Mishlei, Amarti achachema v'hi rechota mimeni. I thought that I was smart, but in the end, the answer is very far from me, and I cannot comprehend. And the same exact thing goes on here. Eov, we know, who experienced utter destruction in his life, may very well have been symbolic with regards to us. Also, ask questions to God, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you don't have the right to ask, you just have to follow my statutes. And here, the outright question is, with no expectation. We ask, knowing that we will not get or receive an answer. And that itself is such a frustrating state of bewilderment, whereby we do not and cannot satisfy ourselves with an answer to understand how these consequences took place. Rav Soloveitchik explains that every single Chag, every single holiday has something called mitzvata shel hayom, which creates what's called itzumo shel hayom. The specific mitzvah that is a commandment and ascribed to that particular Chag, to that particular holiday. For example, we know Lulav and Etrog, Sukkot, Shofar for Rosh Hashanah, Matzah for Pesach, and so on and so forth. But Tisha B'Av has absolutely no mitzvah whatsoever. There is no mitzvah shel hayom. Rav Soloveitchik says that the itzumo shel hayom, the essence of the day, is merely to be in a state of being bewildered, baffled, and utterly sad and destitute as a result. That is the itzumo shel hayom. Later on in the day, we go through and we recite in Mincha after Chatzot, Nachem Hashem, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu offers us Nechama, because as we arrive closer to the second latter part of the day, we arrive closer to Nechama, the experience of being comforted. But right now, the only thing that we are capable of proclaiming is Eicha Atzta Be'apecha. Okay, we go to the kinot number 10. Echa yashva chabatzelet hashavot. By the way, I just want to make it clear: if anyone feels that they need to leave or disturbed by listening to me, I completely understand. My wife has it all the time, so please, it's not rude, and you can feel free to get up if you don't feel well or want to leave at any time. And we look here at the beginning of the kinot. Echa yashva chabatzelet hashavot. Chabatzelet hashavot is actually, it says here, the rose of the Sharon. It's referring to the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash was referred to as Chabatzelet HaSharon in prophetic literature. And it's interesting because one of the questions is why is it called the Sharon? The Sharon is a rose. And Hosea HaNavi, which we read on the Shabbat Shuvah, in the Hosea HaNavi, it says, that I will be like tal, like dew to the Jewish people, and you will blossom like a rose. Why a rose? So I saw the great Rabbi the great scholar of the 18th century. He explains that a rose is a flower. I'm not sure if he was a botanist, and I don't know if it's accurate, but it appears to be that a rose is a flower that is closed. And one cannot possibly appreciate its beauty, its fragrance, when it's in its closed state. But if a person, what happens is the dew of the morning, the wetness, the dampness, sprinkles onto the rose in the morning, and then the rose opens up the petals, and sure enough, it reveals its beauty, its fragrance, and one can appreciate its aesthetics. And the same is with regards to Am Yisrael. Rabbi Yonatan said that every single Jew has the desire, has the will to be good, the desire to be a good person. Every Jew has that within their innards. It's just that sometimes they forget exactly what they're supposed to do. So, for example, classically, all of you are familiar with this. It's one of the most problematic Rambams and Gemaras, which is when a person does not want to divorce his wife, Beitin motziin oto achutza vekofin oto ad sheyom motzani. The Beitin take this guy and they beat him to a pulp until he comes and says, "Okay, I want to give the get." And the obvious question is, you're supposed to give you have to give a get to a song. It has to be done with desire, and by beating the guy up, that's not real desire. He's doing it in order to avoid being hurt. It's a very, very strange Maran, very difficult to understand. So there are some who say that the guy really wants to give the get. He just needs a little nudge. But that's very difficult to understand as well. And Rabbi Yonatan says, based on that internally, the person wants to give the get. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to do what's halachically obligated of him, just like every Jew wants to. And that inner desire exists in each and every one of us. So too the rose. We are like a rose, whereby we might be closed off, but we might not necessarily always reveal our beauty and our desire and our good fragrance. But when the Torah, which is Ein Torah Ela Mayim, Ein Mayim Ela Torah, Mayim water represents the Torah. If we sprinkle a little bit of Torah on someone, they will ultimately reveal and understand their inner desire. So the Beit HaMikdash was meant to awaken within us the inner desire that we have to do good, that we have to be and to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the right and proper way. Now, if we look for a moment at the next page, in the middle at Ot, first of all, it says Kol Ha'ma, go to new kinot, where that's page 176 on the article at the bottom. Kol Ha'ma, go to new kinot, describing a national disaster whereby not just one person is expressing his mourning, but Kol Ha'am, all of the nation, go to new kinot, are expressing that kinot, that mekononim, that state of mourning. And if you look at the next page, Ot Ayin is a beautiful poetry that's described here. Al gabi charshu chokshim va'arichu ma'anik ve'eriku alai cherev v'chanit. On my back the flowers plowed, they lengthened the furrow, they bared sword and spear against it. Now, it's interesting because the reference to cherev v'chanit, the sword and spear, there's a halacha, and it still applies today, and I'll tell you how. There's a halacha where one is not allowed to bring weaponry into the confines of the Beit Knesset. And it's a question that's brought down in halacha in the tzava, the army to this day. We don't know what's going on now. And chayalim, dati chayalim, when they come to a Beit Knesset, in the tzava, they are allowed, because particularly during timonut, basic training, the worst possible offense that a person could do is to leave their gun. And it's actually punishable by a serious amount of time in jail, go home for a long time, etc. It's a very, very, as you can imagine, a serious thing. And during timonut, you sleep with your gun. It's attached to you the entire time. The only time in Army law that they're allowed to take the gun away is when they go into a Beit Knesset. In the Beit Knesset, they're allowed to check in their gun at the entrance to the Beit Knesset because of this halacha. The cherev v'chanit is not allowed to be brought into the Beit HaMikdash because the Beit HaMikdash represents a binyan shalom, a place of peace. David HaMelech, who wanted to construct the Beit HaMikdash, the says, Dam rav shafachta, that you have spilt a tremendous amount of blood. For that reason, he would not be allowed to build the Beit HaMikdash. The obvious question is, David HaMelech spilled blood, but he did so for the sake of protecting the Jewish people. He did so for the sake of expanding the borders of Eretz Yisrael. So it was all altruistic. What was the problem? And Chazal explained that nonetheless, since the Beit HaMikdash was a place of shalom, even if your incentive was corrected in the right place, the moment that you spilled blood, it was not compatible for you to be able to build a place of peace, a place of shalom at Beit HaMikdash. And for that reason, David HaMelech was denied. In addition, if you continue on, it says, "V'hirbeiti tzavot v'ta'anit u'mitzurat tochnit yatsa yevanit." Hirbeiti tzavot v'ta'anit refers, or is a reference to the many fasts that we have, i.e., Tzom Gedalia, which we'll mention in a few moments, Tisha B'Av, obviously, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and Asara B'Tevet, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Asara B'Tevet, and Tzom Gedalia all relate to events that caused the destruction of the temple. So everything in the end of the day goes full circle and comes back to this day, which was the crescendo of that destruction. Finally, Mitzudat Tofnit Yatsa Yevanit, that Tofnit Yatsa Yevanit, that from this entire designation came out the plan that was Greek. And this is the perfect form that's described, the Chavatzelet HaShamot, the Beit HaMikdash, now has become Greek, which is a reference to what's called Elia Capitalina, whereby the Greek dynasty and empire tried to turn Yerushalayim into Hellenism and into an Elia Capitalina, a place that would be ruled by the Greeks for 103 years, and following that by the Romans and Herod the Great, and so on and so on and so forth. And ultimately, obviously, they were destroyed too. But certainly, in the bowels of destruction, this was what was transpiring in front of us.
Number 10, page 174, the article on the bottom of page 17 in the booklets.
Then we go to kinot Aleph by Konen Yirmiyahu, and here we see movement from Tanakh, from the Torah itself, various descriptions based on the Torah of the Beit HaMikdash, and now we move a little bit into the Yirmiyahu is by Konen. Konen is again the kinah, he laments. Why exactly is Yirmiyahu lamenting? He's lamenting in the fact that the Melech Yoshiyahu did not listen to what he had to say in his prophecy. Who was the Melech Yoshiyahu? Melech Yoshiyahu was the first king of Yehuda, who was a tzaddik. He was a very righteous individual. He was able to return Am Yisrael away from idolatry and promiscuous practice. But what happened was, he was warned by Yirmiyahu not to fight with Mitzrayim and not to join with Mitzrayim, and he didn't listen, and he made a pact, and Mitzrayim, of course, never showed up, and hence he was defeated, and that was the entrance of Melech Ashur in the destruction of Yerushalayim as well. The question is, why did Yoshiyahu listen to the words of Yirmiyahu warning him not to make a pact with the Egyptian Empire? Why did he make this mistake? The reason why is Yoshiyahu was overly confident. He saw that he was able to get large parts of Bnei Israel to obstruct him from worshiping Avodah Zarah, and he felt that he was successful in doing so en masse for the large mass majority of Am Yisrael, and he thought that he was in a good place as a result. Because of that overconfidence, he was defeated. And it's interesting because even in the text of this kinot, there is a mention of Avigdor. Avigdor is referring to Moshe. According to the Medrash, Moshe had another name, number of names. One of the names was also Avigdor. And Moshe complains to Hashem, whereby he is discouraged by the Jewish people's behavior a number of times. So, for example, at the very beginning, the onset, when God sends Moshe Rabbeinu to lead Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, Moshe proclaims, "V'hei lo ya'aminu li, ve'ech yashme'eni paro." Bnei Israel will not believe me. The Gemara in Shabbat says that because Moshe said, "Hey lo ya'aminu li," they won't believe me. The Gemara says that he was choshed b'ksherim mokeh b'gufo. Someone who certainly accuses those who are not necessarily proven guilty, they receive tzara'at. And hence we know that Moshe got tzara'at on his arm as one of the signs, but he was afflicted with tzara'at because he accused the Jewish people of not being capable of believing in him and believing in God. That was not acceptable. So Moshe demonstrated a lack of confidence in the Jewish people. Yoshiyahu demonstrated an overly confidence in the Jewish people. And the similar thing happened with regards to Tzom Gedalia. We all know that Gedalia ben Achikam was the governor of Yerushalayim. Many say he was a puppet of the Roman Empire, but nonetheless, he was able to preserve the Jewish community in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, without that much trouble. And then there was an overconfidence that he had, whereby he trusted Benayahu, who was the head of the Jewish Legion, and ultimately he was killed by Benayahu because of this overconfidence in him and what the Jewish people were capable of doing. So what we see is that there has to be a balance between the two. There has to be a confidence in the Jewish people that they can perform, but at the same time, we have to keep things in check in understanding who we are. I like to relate to the time that Bnei Yisrael was standing at the cusp of Yam Suf, of the Reed Sea, and they're told the Egyptian Empire is behind them, and this sea is in front of them. And Moshe apparently is davening to Hashem, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Ma titzak elai, daber el bnei Yisrael v'yiso." Ma titzak, Chazal say tzaka is tefillah. Moshe decided to pray. Here are the Egyptian Empire behind them. Let's just appreciate the scene. The sea that's in front of them is not the Jordan, we call it in Israel the Jordan River, but it's more like the Jordan Pond. It's right. So we take these rubber boats and we go down this we call it kayaking. It's more like, a rubber ducky, and you can pretty much jump off the boat at any time and touch the bottom. It's not a raging river. And here, the Jewish people are confronted with not the Jordan River, they're confronted with the sea. They're a broken people. They are destitute people. They were enslaved. They're not strong. And yet they're told, visa, just continue forward. And what exactly does that mean? That basically meant that they had to jump into the sea. You could all witness a bunch of 600,000 Jews standing and being told to jump into the sea. See one like touches the water and it's a little cold for me. I really don't think so. Maybe I prefer the jacuzzi, but it's not going to happen. So here, nonetheless, they're in charge with doing so. And the reason why is HaKadosh Baruch Hu is testing the faith of Am Yisrael. In order for the Kriyat Yam Suf to transpire, there had to be the partnership of Am Yisrael together. They had to prove that they would partner with Hashem at that point. And that's exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was beseeching from them, that they should jump in, demonstrate that they're capable of partnering with Hashem, and only then HaKadosh Baruch Hu would kick in the nace. And the same thing is here. Well, we do have to demonstrate a confidence in who we are, and that we are capable, and that we can move forward. At the same time, we have to always keep ourselves in check in terms of not getting overly confident and recognizing our weaknesses as well. And that is the only way we can accomplish the so. Yudan. We go now to the Kina Yud Zayin 17. And the very first question that's asked here, and this is something that's described in Lamentations and Eicha as well, about the fact that mothers were forced to devour their children because they just didn't have what to sustenance. And here too, the very onset of the Kina is Im tochalna nashim kiryam olelei tipuchim. How could it happen that women would eat the fruit of their own womb? Those children that they bore in their womb. And the reason why this is so powerful is because we are meant to feel the rapport that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is compared to an Av Laben or an Aim Libno, a father to a child, a mother to a child, because the greatest instinct that a person has with regards to care, love, protection is a parent to a child. And what's being described here is a situation whereby the parent could no longer protect and preserve that child, not to make up to the extent that the parent was responsible for their demise. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he's frustrated with Am Yisrael, as I mentioned yesterday, he says clearly, did I impregnate myself with these children? In other words, Moshe himself understands that the greatest rapport that could exist is between a parent and a child. And he says that I did not bear these children, and therefore I am not necessarily responsible for them. Demonstrating to us that the greatest responsibility we have is to children that we do bear, that we did bear. And where HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroyed the Yerushalayim and cast us out to the diaspora demonstrates that our Father was no longer interested in creating that rapport between a parent and a child. The greatest possible loss or the greatest possible frustration, difficulty that a parent has is when they lose influence over their child, when the child is no longer listening to them, when they're no longer under their auspices. I often explain, we were Zocha, Baruch Hashem, to marry off two daughters, and one cries as they watch their daughter go to the chuppah or whatnot. And one of the reasons why I think parents cry myself is you realize that this child will no longer go to you first for advice, but they will now be going to the moron who they married. I'm just joking. They'll now be going to a different person who they married, and you no longer have the influence over them that you once had. They're no longer going to consult with you first. And you know that inevitably, as such, they're going to make mistakes. But one of the reasons why we cry is because we're losing that opportunity to have influence on our child. you're no longer their primary address. And this is the pain that's being expressed here as well. It's painful for a parent when they cannot provide their child with the ability to obstruct pain, with the ability to obstruct confrontation or challenge. I'll just bear with you as a public message, a promo. So I wrote a book called Armed with Spirit, one of the books that I wrote. In fact, it's for sale in the back. And there's only 2 copies left here, so get them. They're selling like hotcakes. But this is a promo. But when my son, it's a correspondence of my son and I when he was serving in the Army. And when he went into advanced training, now Yaakov, our son, he's a huge dude, and we call him the Big Bear. He's seriously, he's a very strong, powerful guy, and he's a fantastic soldier because he listens to commands, he does what needs to be done, and he's capable of doing it. And when he got to the second part of his training, it was rather difficult. And the first week, they took away a phone from him, and the first week on Erev Shabbat, they allowed them to call their parents to say Shabbat Shalom for a few minutes. Of course, first thing that he did was use most of his minutes to check what's going on with his team in NFL football. And then he called us for about 30 seconds. But when he called me, I could sense in his voice that it was a bit broken. And he almost sounded like this big bear was going to cry. And I said to him, Yaakov, are you all right? You sound like you're going to be. He said, well, Abba, it's really tough. You know, this week we went through training and crawling through thorn bushes, and they're shooting over our heads as to get used to the battle and war, etc. Very tough. And he said, and I could see in the distance lights in the city from afar. And he said, all I could think about was, what exactly is going through my family's minds right now while I sit here far away from him? So I felt bad for him. And I said to him the only thing that I could think of. I said, Yanki, I want you to know if I could change places with you, I would. And he said back to me, Abba, I want you to know that if you could change places with me, I wouldn't let you. And it was very exhilarating when you have that connection, that rapport with the child, that understanding. But here what's being described in this kinot is that it's completely lost. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the metaphor of a mother devouring a child, it is the metaphor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu devouring his nation in an ability to have the connection with us. You look at the second page on page 236. About a quarter of a way down, it says, Im ta'arofna al-dam naki 80,000 kohanim v'shluchim oleloi li. Woe is to us if it could happen that 80,000 kohanim were beheaded over the innocent blood of Zechariah Hanavi. And this is referring to the Gemara, which talks about in Gittin, which talks about Torrance Nofrus, who was the Roman Empire, the legionnaire, who saw blood boiling on the floor of the Mikdash, and he started slaughtering Kohanim, and the blood continued to boil, and he screamed to God, when are you going to answer, respond to your children, and let their blood boil as such, and eventually as such the blood stopped boiling. But he had butchered 80,000 Kohanim as a result. And there's also reference to the Gemara in Ta'anit, the fascinating Gemara, which says that when the Romans were entering the confines of the Mikdash, Pirchei Kuna Alu Legan, they went up to the rooftops of the confines, the inner confines of the temple. They took the chambers, the keys to the inner chambers of the Mikdash. They threw it up to the heavens. A hand came outstretched to the heavens and drew the keys inward into the heavens themselves. The hem not flew and these young priests jumped and died in the fires below, in the flames, that were burning asunder. And the question is, what does this represent? What it represents is the young boys were saying to us through their death that the keys to enter the Echad, the keys to enter the confines of the Mikdash, are no longer in our hands. In other words, it no longer is up to us that we can assure the Jewish people a allegiance, a connection, a loyalty to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Used to be that if Bnei Israel needed kapara, they needed tshuva, they would hand the korban to the Kohen. The Kohen would bring the korban into the confines of the Mikdash, and it would be it would be sacrificed, and as such, Bnei Israel would receive kapara. Now they're proclaiming that is no longer the case. We are no longer capable of doing so. Now it is completely in our hands to ensure once again the reconstruction of the Mikdash.
In the 17th, verse 222, the article in the bottom of page 29.
Okay, we go to the kinot Chof Aleph, Arzei Halvanon. Arzei Halvanon Adirei HaTorah. Arzei Halvanon are the cedars of Lebanon, the giants of Torah. This is referring to the Asara Harugei Malchut, the 10 great pillars of the Jewish community, the rabbis who were destroyed and killed in the most cruel and brutal of ways. Now, the first question is, why are they referred to as Arzei Halvanon, Adirei Torah, the cedar wood, the cedar trees? Fascinating insight is that Shlomo HaMelech, the construction of the first Beit HaMikdash, built the temple out of cedar wood. And in fact, he imported the cedar wood from Syria, from Hirom Melech Tzur, because cedar wood does not grow naturally, in the land of Israel. He had to import it from Hirom, who he had a relationship with, and hence the Beit HaMikdash was built out of cedar wood. But why did the Mikdash have to be built out of specifically Lebanon? So I saw a fascinating insight by Rabbi Yonatan Eibushin to explain that cedar wood is the most powerful wood, a very, very strong wood that exists, but it can only grow in an extremely fertile area that has rivers and lakes, tremendous amounts of water. So too, as we said before, a mayim ela Torah. The Beit HaMikdash could be built by cedar wood, demonstrating that its affiliation with water, its need for water, i.e., limud Torah, subscription to the mitzvot. Otherwise, the Mikdash would be destroyed. If we lose sight of how the Mikdash preserves us, or how we preserve it, i.e., through our allegiance to Torah and mitzvot, and through our keeping the Torah and mitzvot, then ultimately the Beit HaMikdash, even in its powerful state of being built of cedar wood, will be destroyed. Now, why are these, what is the reference to these Asara Harugei Malchut, these outstanding tzaddikim? Rav Soloveitchik points out that there are 2 times in the year when we refer to Asara Harugei Malchut, these great outstanding scholars. One, as we know, is on Yom HaKippurim, in the middle of Musaf of Yom HaKippurim, and the second is here in the middle of the kinot. But they are for very 2 opposing, contrasting reasons. Rav Soloveitchik says on Yom HaKippurim we refer to these tzaddikim because the Gemara says mitat tzaddikim mechaprim al avodoteim shel Yisrael. The death of tzaddikim, their departure from this world, can serve as a kapara for the sins that we do. Hence, Yom HaKippurim. But on Tisha B'Av, that's not the reason. On Tisha B'Av, the reason why is because Chazal also say, Shkulim mitat tzadikim kechorban Beit HaMikdash. The demise, the departure of outstanding scholars in our confines is comparable to the loss of our temple, of the Beit HaMikdash. Here we lost the 10 great pillars of Am Yisrael, hence the destruction of the Mikdash and our destruction of the inners, the leadership of our community. I want to refer for a moment to the great Rabbi Akiva, as we did last night. Here, in this particular kinot, if you look at the next page on page 252 in the art scroll, so it talks about Sarkuet Besaro B'Masrek Shebarzel Lehishtabra Yatsa Nishmato Be'echad Bat Kol Amra Ashrecha Rabbi Akiva Gufach Tahom B'Chol B'nei Tahara. They combed his flesh with hot iron combs, and ultimately Rabbi Akiva departed from this world. And in the Gemara Brachot, it tells the story of a Talmud, if you're familiar with it, a student of Rabbi Akiva who questions God and says, Zu Torah v'zu Schara. How can it be that someone who was so great, such a giant in the Torah world, that would be his end, his consequence, the conclusion of his life, that he would suffer as such? And the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva recited at that moment Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. In fact, the Gemara says that he recited Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharit, the morning Kriyat Shema. Why? The reason why is twofold. Shacharit, the morning, represents hope. It represents that there is a renewal, that there will come a day, that there will come a time when once again we'll be able to witness the rejuvenation, the reinvigoration of Yerushalayim. But at the same time, Shema Yisrael, we cover our eyes. Halachically, we do so in order to help us concentrate. Because one has to at least concentrate in that first verse of Shema Yisrael. But there are those commentators who explain here with the story of Rabbi Akiva that he covered his eyes, demonstrating that there are things in this world that are left to the divine, that we don't necessarily understand, that we cannot possibly comprehend. Rabbi Akiva makes a statement that even though there are many things that are unclear in our lives, nonetheless, there is a commitment, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, a commitment to God as one. It's an interesting thing I often ask. We all know that during the period of Pesach to Shavuot, that 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died during this time because they were not respectful to one another. Imagine that. Jews who were not respectful to one another. Never heard of such a thing. But the fact is that here 24,000 of them, of his Talmudic students, were not respectful and they all died. Now, if I was Rabbi Akiva, let's just say the Gemara is exaggerating. 24,000 is a huge amount of people. Let's say it was 1,000, or let's just say it was 100, or let's say it was 50 students who died in one period of time for not respecting one another. If I was Rabbi Akiva, I'd say, my students are not respectful to one another. They're all dead. Maybe it's time for me to become an accountant. Maybe this rabbi thing is just not working out that well. You're obviously not a great rabbi if your students are not respectful to one another and they're all dying. It's a serious problem. But Rabbi Akiva does not do so. The Gemara says that he goes down south and he finds 5 new Talmidim and he actually renews the entire Jewish community once again. So he obviously made the right decision. The decision that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted him to, and he ultimately was successful in doing so. And so what's being expressed here is, at one hand, the ability to have an incomprehension of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does what he does, but at the same time, to demonstrate an affinity and a loyalty to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects from us as well.
الرزال بنادي أترى بلاد رزال بمشنا بالمراد ورخوة مليا بتاورات من نستدبر نظام كل شهر وكما كنت أسرع بل إذا نبقيها بينين كرا زوج بسخرية سك مرا نمدكي سوكيا كورش نسبة ترى ورد كرسيما ميت بمتاك مرا يتوكرا ميرشون نخير برا انفوزر على ربان شمانا پشت مرو وقت كمزرات زرا برابن شمن خسر هایمانا لهرکا به نفت بسرعت بزرران شعب بکشانی کاتا بین هکبیرت نتروشون تنو الارکوتا منورت را سمینه ولی نبوفی و پیوه بابک برا انه ورنا پیه میتکبه بطرا بیتون نگنس قلم میتمشو نوکه مرا زبال افشی تتوشا به ترش گیره کیم را امرو لنفسك شخي بنابورها رشا بوشيت اتجال كونفلين بفترة تتكام نلتاسا علامة باتكررة ما يخرب بيو تربية كبا وكررين وتوكنان وصوب سرا بسرقوت بسرا بمسرق شبسال لستبرا يستانش بطو بخد وبد كل أمرا أشرك ربية كبا كفت تهور بخمينة تورا بن باب ربي يودا أكرم הביאו בשברון לב בעזרה, ורק בשבעים שנה בידי ארורה, יושב בתענית היה נקי וחסיד, בלבדו למערב. רבי חנינא בן שרדון אחריו המכיר קהילות בציון שערה, יושב ונראה ספר רמו, וקיפוהו בחבלי שמרה, את האור הציתו בהמה, וכרכו בספר תורה, ספוקין של תמר הניח בליבו, שלא ימות מהרה. חסיד רבי ישבה בספר, הרגו עם אמרה, זרקו והשליכו לכלבים ולא הוגבר בכפורה, יצתה בת כל עליו שלא יניח כלום מתורת משה לשמרה, ואחריו רבי קוטבית ביום עברה, ובבורך נשרף, אבל פיו כבמדורה. צדיק רבי אלעזר בן שמוע באחרונה נהרג במקדירה, יום ערב שבת היה זמן קידוש ויקדש ויקרא, כרם שלפו עליו לא הניחו בחיים לא קומרה, יצתה נשמתו בברא אלוהים יוצר ותצורה. כהנה וכהנה הוסיפו בני עוולה לענות בגרה, בסגילה שרפה הרג וחנק מיוחד לשערה, נותרת ממנה יאכלו אריות סף פזורה, כזה התנופה בשוק התרומה, שרפו אריה התפירה, יציב אדוני ולא יוסיף עוד לישרה, אמץ ברכיים כושלות חלק יעקב משה בעצרה, לצדק ימלוך מלך יאמר שרמו ימי אבלך, לאורו נישא ונלך.
We go to Kina Lamed Aleph. This is a very famous Kina. There are those who sing it actually, demonstrating the contrast that exists here. Because what it says is, a fire of elation. In other words, we're talking about a fire that was inspiring to me. As I came out of Mitzrayim, but I have woken the Kinim, the Abelut, the morning, for the sake of remembrance as I leave Yerushalayim. And in the contrast, this entire Kina is built on contrasting events. The events that transpired when Bnei Yisrael came out of Mitzrayim, which obviously are described with jubilance, and the events that transpired with Tzeitim Yerushalayim, the tragedies that transpired as I left the confines of Yerushalayim, which is obviously the sad and tragic event. And there are two insights that are offered here. For example, Rav Soloveitchik explains that this Kena comes to infuse or to remind us, really, based on the Gemara Brachot, which says, "Kishem shemevarchim ala tova, kach mevarchim ala ra'ah." Just as a person has to say a blessing to Hashem for giving to us what appears to be good, we also have to bless to Hashem for giving to us what appears to be bad. And hence, every time that someone, Rahman al-Islam, is nifter, passes on, we say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. It's a very, very strange reaction. We make a bracha. Essentially, the bracha is really meant to remind us that even though we don't understand, and it's so sad and tragic, HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately knows what he's doing. It's much easier said than done, but that's our reaction. I'm not sure, by the way. In fact, I was once here in South Africa, and someone came over to me and asked me this question regarding the South African community, why everyone says long life. I don't know. I'm not sure where that comes from. Rabbis say it, right? Every time someone dies, we wish you long life. What is the premise of that? Do you know why they say that? South African thing. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to know where that comes from. But in any event, I mean, obviously we say to people who are alive, you should live for a long life. But the normal response is Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. We make this bracha because we just, even on bad events. And the Medrash says, Ein Adam Lokef Etzba'o Lamata, even the smallest of transpiring of events that happen here in this world, they don't happen without God saying so. So everything is within his divine transferring of events. And it's challenging for us to be able to see those events and understand them, hence the connection between what we just said with Rabbi Akiva and this Kina as well, not understanding everything that God does to us as individuals and as a nation as well. I also want to point out that it's interesting because in this Kina, all of the events that are described in Satan Mitzrayim, coming out of Egypt, they are chronological. Whereas all of the events that are described in Satan Yerushalayim are completely miscombobulated. There is absolutely no method to the entire madness. That's exactly what the Kina is saying. When it came to the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim, it was all comprehensible. We could understand it. It was comprehensive as well. We understand that Kadosh Baruch Hu was taking us through the stages of Exodus, whereas in Yerushalayim, everything was chaos. There was not anything that we could possibly understand. Everything was haphazard. I once met Rav Simcha Cohen Cook Zal, who was just nifter this year. He was the chief rabbi of Rehovot for many, many years. And I once met him during communism in the great synagogue in Moscow. And of all places, I went over to him and I said, right? What a mikre, what a happenstance that we're meeting here. And he said, there's no such thing as mikre. If you take Mem Kuf Reish Hey and you spin around the letters, it's Rak Me Hashem. Only from Hashem does everything happen. At first glance, it looks like mikre. Because Rak Me Hashem, you still have to shuffle the letters around in order to make that statement happen. But even though everything seems like happenstance, ultimately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu controls the destiny and calls the shots. And this is what we're describing, the understanding, the comprehension that we have with Yetziat Mitzrayim as opposed to complete chaos and lack of comprehension with Seiti Yerushalayim. You guys have a song? Yeah. And this kinot was written by Rabbi who lived in the 1100s in Zaragoza, Spain, during the golden age of Spain. And what's described here in the heart of the kinot is that the voices stopped. There was utter and total silence. Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal points out the difference at what point voices are silent. So in Shmot Perek Tet, the Torah describes Vayetzei Moshe mi'im Paro et ha'ir vayifros kapav el Hashem vayachtolu hakolo dabarar matar nolitach arza. Meaning, Paro would ask Moshe to pray for the Egyptian people that the particular plague should end. And Moshe would have to leave the city, as I'll explain, Rashi explains the reason being, because there was a Avodah Zarah in the confines of Mitzrayim, and therefore Moshe could not pray there, so he would leave the confines of the city, and then it would say, the crime of Egypt, of the Egyptians as a result of the plague, stopped because of Moshe's prayer. Says Rav Soloveitchik, look at the difference. Here we were able to celebrate the Mitzrayim by the Egyptians stopped crying because their plague ended, and it brought us as a Jewish nation one step closer to redemption, to the Exodus, whereas here by are the flip side It's no longer a description about the Egyptian people, it's a description about us. That we are unable to cry, that we are unable to explain or to proclaim anything with regards to Hashem. Our voices have stopped, failed. We no longer have the. This relates, by the way, to the kinot that we just described now. The difference between Mitzaytim Mitzrayim and Mitzaytim Yerushalayim. Tragedy that befell the Egyptian Empire, now the same tragedy that befell the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. It's also a similar experience what Rav Soloveitchik explains regarding the last thing that we do on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The last thing that we do is we blow the shofar. Rav Soloveitchik says that the shofar represents the animal cry, the raw call of the animal to the heavens above. We are, says Rav Soloveitchik, essentially animals. We no longer have the power of speech. We don't have the ability to articulate our tefillah, our expression to God, because we are so wayward and so lost that all we could do is resound the shofar and cry out like an animal. And this also is what is expressed here. Our inability to articulate, our inability to express, to verbalize what we're going through. We're lost in a state of confusion. And this is the connection between the last kinot, this kinot, and the state in which we find ourselves leaving Yerushalayim. We look at Kina Lamed Vav. So these next few kinot are describing what's called Zion. Zion, as we said last night, Zion refers to Yerushalayim. Now, it's very strange, sometimes some of our practices are a little warped. For example, the opening statement of this Kina is the famous one that we're familiar with, Zion Haloti Shaliv the Shalom Asirayim. What we're saying is Zion, Jerusalem, will you not ask with regards to your imprisoned, i.e. the Jewish people, as a result, that we're no longer in Yerushalayim. If you think about it, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the song, where we sing Tia, 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 it's really weird because we sing it like as if we're joyous, it's like a fun song, but it's actually, it's part of the Kina, it's a depressing statement, it's a very sad statement. We're asking, like, when will you, God, think or ask about your imprisoned people, the Jewish people? And yet it's a song. There's another song like that, by the way, by Avram Fried. I can't remember what it is, but it sings like a jubilant, like he's singing like, Labor Day, and it's actually a song about Rishoyim. I don't remember which song it is. My friend pointed it out to me, and he wrote an email to Avram Fried saying, why are you singing, like enjoying this song when it's all about like enjoying? They said, and he actually said, like, maybe you're right. The song is the #1 bestseller, so we'll forget about that one. But the point is that Zion is a reference to Yerushalayim. And Zion, why? The reason why is because Zion actually also means, in Hebrew, it means Evan. It means a rock. Zion is a mark, a place that's marked, and hence we say in Hebrew, Litzayen. Litzayen means that I am making my mark, or I'm marking this particular place. So, for example, Zion, Litzayen, we used to buy 2 stones that are marking a marker for this particular place where the person rests. And Yerushalayim, classically, was always fortified by Zion, by rocks, by avanim, by stones. And therefore, the Tzayin, we mark places with those stones. We take the word Evan in Hebrew, which means stone, and we break it apart. It actually knows 2 derivatives. Are Evan, Av, Ben, right? Father, son. And what we're saying is that the Evan, to be strong like a rock, requires us to have the Av, Ben, the father, son, the continuity of future generations in order to assure that there is commitment and that we can continue to perpetuate. Rav Soloveitchik points out that the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had many things that he instituted, Zecher LeMikdash. So, for example, we say Zecher LeMikdash Kehillel, Kenas Sahillel, Bisman Shahaya Mikdash Hayam. We would take the mahor and the charoset and the matzah and make it into a koreh. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one who instituted that the lulav should be brought Kol Shiva, shofar b'Shabbat should not be brought Sheva Yavadenu Dal'Allah b'Shut Havavim, even though in the Mikdash it was blown. And these various practices were instituted by Rabbi Yochanan in order to remember what happened in the Mikdash, so that we can embrace that memory. Says Rav Soloveitchik, these were all positive that were instituted, i.e., regarding not carrying the shofar, not carrying the lulav, so that we can demonstrate our allegiance to God. But now, all is for naught. We have nothing left. Now, it is all symbolic. In Kabbalah, and I don't know anything about Kabbalah, I'll tell you a very interesting, it's not that interesting, but I'll share it with you because it gives a little bit of a break from this heavy learning the entire time. I was invited once to Australia to speak on a Friday night to these young professionals group, and they were all youngsters and yuppies of their age. And when the rabbi invited me, I asked him, "What do you want me to speak about?" So he said, "I want you to speak about Kabbalah." So I said to him, "Listen, Rabbi, I can speak about virtually anything except for that. I don't know any Kabbalah. I have no interest in Kabbalah. I've never looked at it in my life, and I can't." He said, "You must speak about Kabbalah because it's what resonates with the youth. The yuppies love it, and you got to speak about it." So I actually got up and I said, "I'm going to speak tonight about why the rabbi demanded that I speak about Kabbalah and why I cannot." And that was my talk. And the point is that the only thing I know about Kabbalah is that there are 4 levels of creation to this world, and those are Domen, Someach, Chayim, Medaber. Domen, well, let's go from the top. Medaber, man, is called Medaber, someone who can speak, someone who can articulate, use the power of speech. It's interesting because it doesn't say Adam, it says Medaber, because our Koach HaDibur is the highest level of creation. The second to highest is life, something that is alive. Next to Someach, something that grows in the ground. Finally, the lowest level of creation is Domen. Domen is Dvama, total, utter silence. The domain is typically ascribed to a rock, a stone. That's exactly what's being described here. The Tzion, Halot Tishali, the rock, the stone, is incapable of asking. It's incapable of expressing or articulating. And therefore, we are just completely shut down with regards to our inability to describe what's going on. When we say Tzion L'Shlom HaSirayich, it means we should ask, when will you, Hashem, when will Tzion, Yerushalayim, explain why we are prisoners? And the truth is that that's inappropriate. So if we want to know why we're prisoners as a result of the destruction of the temple, we should ask the Romans. We should ask the Babylonians, not Tzion, not Yerushalayim. Rav Soloveitchik explains the reason why is because ultimately we are our own worst enemy. We, the Jewish people, decide our fate. We, the Jewish people, describe whether or not our temple in Yerushalayim is going to be destroyed or whether it will be preserved. Whether or not it's destroyed or whether and if at what time it will be reconstructed. So it is a reminder to us as well that we have to be able to incorporate and understand how responsible we are to our own destiny. I want to mention something that I often mention that was said and proclaimed by Rabbi Lau. He wrote a sefer, the book Out of the Depths, you all know it, explains his autobiography and his survival with the Holocaust. In Hebrew, the book is far more effective in terms of the title. It's called Out to Stop El Hana. Do not lay a hand upon this child, which is a very, very powerful title. But what he often says over and over again is that the Holocaust has taught the Jewish people how to die together. The land of Israel is supposed to teach the Jewish people how to live together. Which, by the way, living together is far more challenging than dying together. And that ultimately has to be the message of these kinot, that we have to learn that we are our own worst enemy. We are responsible for offering that response. We are responsible for ultimately, certainly paving our destiny in the way of reconstruction once again.
Kinot 36, page 329, and also.
Going to point out two more things on two more kinot, and we're going to end with Elizion. One is in kinot Lamed Chet, which is 38. It's called Tzion Aderet Tzvi. So here, once again, another kinot that refers to Tzion. Tzion, which we just said is referring to Yerushalayim. Now, classically, Tzion is supposed to be a description of beauty, but here, rather, what we said last night, the Chayah, has the beauty, now it's the Tzion that is completely plowed over, destroyed, and decimated. Tzion Aderet Tzvi is referring to Eretz HaTzvi. Eretz HaTzvi is also a description of Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash. And Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal explains that the reason why we refer to all of these Tzion is so that we should understand the painted details of what Yerushalayim looked at in order to allow us to accentuate, to appreciate how much more so it meant to us. Now, Eretz HaTzvi is an interesting thing because it refers to a deer skin. And the reason why Chazal explained, the reason why Eretz Yisrael is referred to as a deer skin is because the skin of a deer is expansive. It's enabled, or it has the ability to expand and stretch. And much like description in the Mishnayot of some of the miracles that transpired in the confines of the Mikdash, whereby multitudes of people would be in the Mikdash and everyone would prostrate down and bow at one time. How was there room enough? And the Mishnah said that was one of the nisim, one of the miracles that happened in the confines of the Mikdash was that everyone had room to bow down in front of Hashem and the Mikdash itself. So this describes Eretz HaTzvi, this expanding deer skin that could contract and expand. Once was a Israeli lady in New Jersey, and she said to me, this guy just came over to me and said to me, that Israel is no bigger than the state of New Jersey. And she said, really? I never knew that New Jersey was so big. And the point is that Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz HaTzvi because of its ability to miraculously expand. Rav Seidegon says that Eretz HaTzvi actually comes from Tzava. Tzvi is Tzava, military, the land of the military, the land that requires the defense, which is obviously very appropriate now as we find ourselves in a time of Eid Sarah and our ability to be able to protect Eretz HaTzvi through the Tzava in Eretz Yisrael. And finally, I make reference to Kinot Mem Aleph Shalis Kufa Ba'esh. This is written by the Maharam Rothenburg of the 13th century in France. King Louis, he burned the Talmud based on an apostate named Nicholas Dunin, who was a convert to Christianity, challenged the Maharam Rothenburg. He lost the challenge, but nonetheless, the Maharam was imprisoned and by a King Rudolph, and he rotted and died in prison. His body was left for 11 years to rot in prison, and he was in prison for 11 years, and 4 years after his death, the Jewish people were able to release his body for burial, and miraculously, his body did not decompose and remained preserved as our tzaddikim. And therefore, it describes through Ba'esh how Jerusalem was burnt and consumed by fire. Rabbi Dr. Ariel, the chief rabbi of Ramat Gan, explains that Eish, fire, has the ability to both be destructive and constructive. When a person wants to make steel, they'll take the steel and they'll run it through fire and then place it in water, and that brandishes the iron and steel and gives it its strength. So fire has the ability to build, to construct, to strengthen, but fire obviously can also be so destructive. Therefore, the obvious difference between these two events of Shalis Kufa Ba'esh, the fire that has the ability to construct, has now been the fire that destructs. The burning of the Torah that happened on Tet Tammuz, which we fast also on Asara Tammuz, remembering Saraf Apostropos et Torah, that he burned the Torah itself, and therefore here we are. We find ourselves in the confines of the flames. Hopefully, we can witness through the destruction of those flames the strength of the flames, the reconstruction, when we'll be able to witness the true fire of Torah, the flame that will be long-lasting, the Der Tamid, that should always remind us ultimately where we come from, and hopefully we will be able to go in Me'avi Amen.
Zubala kalmasın.